Good morning or good afternoon, and this is a presentation of the Center for Future Consciousness. And I'm Tom Lombardo. I'm the director of the Center for Future Consciousness, and the Center for Future Consciousness produces a monthly newsletter, and we also have a video school, which are linked to the website. If you're interested, I'll come back and talk about the video school a little bit later. And here are my various published books in psychology, philosophy, future studies, science fiction, and recently, in fact, in the last month, which I haven't even put up on that opening screen, Victor Motti, the director of the World Future Study Federation, and myself just published a free ebook on Victor's new Alternative Planetary Futures Institute, a dialogue on science fiction, how to achieve planetary wisdom through future consciousness. So that one you can access through Victor's website for free. The mission of the Center for Future Consciousness is to advance the purposeful evolution of humanity through the heightening of future consciousness and wisdom, and the inspirational, mythic, and cosmic power of science fiction. And today, I'm going to be introducing my two new books, volumes 2 and 3, on science fiction, the evolutionary mythology of the future. I have up there an image of volume 1, and for those of you who are not familiar with volume 1, I'll say a bit on it as well so that you can get a perspective on the whole 3 volumes, which are an ongoing and developing evolutionary history of science fiction. An opening quote and an opening question from George Santayana, the American philosopher. Progress, far from consisting in change, depends on retentiveness. When experience is not retained, as amongst savages, infancy is perpetual. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. This is the condition of children and barbarians, in whom instinct has learned nothing from experience. And I put that quote up because it provides an answer to why study the historical evolution of science fiction. Science fiction indeed has an extremely rich and extensive history of thinking about the future, about alternative realities, about robots, about technology, about utopias and dystopias that runs back at least 2,000 years. And for those of us who are interested in thinking about the future, science fiction provides a wealth of ideas that have been created by writers of the past. So indeed, those who are interested in the future do well to look at the history of thinking about the future and the history of thinking about all of those various topics connected with the future. And science fiction has this incredibly rich and varied history of ideas running back over 2,000 years. Most of us are familiar with more recent material and more recent literature and movies, but the history of science fiction is an incredible repository to stimulate and inform. And as I often mention to people who say they want to write science fiction, well, you need to read it first, because no matter how original you think your ideas are, you probably find somebody in the past who had a similar idea or similar ideas. So in fact, studying the history of science fiction, just like studying the history of futurist thinking in general, is extremely valuable, if not necessary, area of study for anyone who wants to consider the possibilities of the future ahead of us. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to give a little introduction here to volume 1, although this is a book launch for volumes 2 and 3 primarily, so that you can see how volumes 2 and 3 developed from volume 1. You could put the 2 volumes that just came out in perspective with where this began. Volume 1 was subtitled Prometheus to the Martians. And in volume 1, I talked about the power of myth and how myth has been a significant, influential dimension of consciousness and thinking throughout human history. And it hasn't gone away. And I compare science fiction with myth in that science fiction, in many, many ways, is similar to myth, only informed by contemporary theories of reality. So, for example, I have up here an image of Star Wars, which in many, many ways is contemporary myth, but framed within contemporary scientific thinking. Myth, in fact, goes back thousands and thousands of years. And indeed, thinking about the future in myth goes back thousands of years. And I have up here some sources that I discuss in volume 1, such as the myth of Prometheus and Zoroaster's vision of linear time and progress, and St. Augustine's archetypal utopia in City of God, a utopia which pointed toward an evolved and progressive future, although it was religiously informed by the metaphysics of Christian theology. But future consciousness, that is awareness of the future and speculations on the future, get connected up with myth and actually go back at least 2,000 years, if not earlier. And I discussed that in volume 1. Contemporary science fiction, though, is informed by modern science, enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment, and the view of progress. And some illustrative examples of early science fiction that were informed by modern science and the idea of progress include Kepler's Journey to the Moon, written in the early 17th century, which was informed by contemporary science, his story called Somnium, the Dream, and The New Atlantis by Francis Bacon, that is filled with technological projections in a utopian society envisioned in contemporary times. And so Bacon's book, The New Atlantis, sets the stage for many, many techno-empowered utopias that would be written in the coming centuries, utopias that are informed and inspired by science and technology. But also, as another significant heritage or point of origin for modern science fiction, we have Romanticism to emphasize emotion instead of reason and science, and we have the Gothic to emphasize fear about the future and fear about reality and horror. And of course, the classic example is Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley, but also I should mention here as two equally good early novels that were romantic and Gothic, The Last Man, which is a vision of the far, far future where human civilization collapses due to exhausting our resources, and The Sandman, which is scarier and spookier than Frankenstein and involves a female robot that the main character falls in love with. So between the Enlightenment and Romanticism and the Gothic, we see both hope and fear and reason and emotion. Both of those pairs are those dimensions of consciousness working their way into science fiction. Do we feel hopeful about the future or fearful? Do we use reason with respect to the future, or are we influenced more by emotion? In the 19th century, we find the beginning of great scientifically informed adventures like Jules Verne's Off on a Comet. We find visions of the future evolution of humanity, like in Edward Buller Lytton's The Coming Race. And we find ambiguous utopias that involve technological projection and social extrapolation, like The 20th Century by Albert Robida, which I think is one of the great science fiction novels of the 19th century. A very well-rounded and rich vision of Paris 100 years from Robida's present time. And Robida was the first great science fiction artist, and he illustrated that book profusely. But also in the 19th century, you find the beginning of visions of wars in the future, like the Battle of Dorking, which actually stimulated something like 300 or 400 future war novels after it. We find more modern versions of robots in Tomorrow's Eve, where the central character is Thomas Edison, fictitiously conceived. And we find fear about machines taking over reality in Erewhon by Samuel Butler, which is informed by Darwin's theory of evolution. And also in the late 19th century, we find the first best-selling science fiction novel written in America, A Journey in Other Worlds by John Jacob Astor, which is an extremely rich vision both of technological and economic progress in the future and journeying through outer space, and then throws in a theological element on top of it all. And Kurt Laswitz, very rich and intelligent vision of a Martian civilization, which comes to Earth, and we have a variety of interactions with it. And we have the cosmic speculations of Camille Flammarion, extrapolating out millions of years in the future in Omega, the last days of the world. So there's a lot of thinking and a lot of rich writing going on in science fiction by the time we get to the end of the 19th century. And as I conclude in volume 1 and use as 3 examples, H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come, and Olaf Stapleton's Last and First Men, and Dan Simmons' Hyperion, science fiction is evolutionary mythology. It evolves, it transforms, it isn't static like ancient mythologies are. And it also incorporates into it the theory of evolution. And it doesn't just cover the future of science and technology, it covers the future of everything. And so that's sort of where I conclude with volume 1, and I'm just highlighting volume 1, of course, but all of those various topics illustrated and discussed come up in volume 1. Now, as we turn to volume 2 and 3, volume 2 and 3 are anchored by the 2 most influential writers in science fiction, H.G. Wells and Olaf Stapleton. Volume 2 begins with H.G. Wells, and volume 3 ends with Olaf Stapleton. I call them the 2 pillars in the evolutionary trajectory of science fiction and futurist thought between 1895 and 1940. They knew each other, they both shared a lot in common, but in various ways they created very different visions of the future, which I will go into. So volume 2 and 3 are very rich in their treatment of these 2 individual authors who provide the beginning and the ending of the 2 volumes. Up there, we see an early drawing of the time traveler from the Time Machine, where the time traveler is holding the delicate Eloy Weena, while the hideous subterranean Morlock are trying to steal Weena away from the time traveler. And this is out of the Time Machine. But note that the illustration of the time traveler is very similar in appearance to how H.G. Wells looked. And indeed, when H.G. Wells developed the Time Machine, it went through 7 or 8 different rewrites. And early on, the time traveler describes himself as a man born out of my time, a man thinking the thoughts of a wiser age, doing things and believing things that men now cannot understand. My age was still to come. And I suggest to you that that description that Wells gives of the time traveler is a description that Wells applies to himself. He sees himself, or he saw himself, as someone who's looking out ahead and thinking of things that people today cannot appreciate or understand. And he was born into an era too soon. And so Wells clearly identifies himself as a visionary about the shape of things to come. And in fact, that's where his writing career eventually went as he progressed through his various novels and nonfiction works. A quote from Stapleton, though, has a different kind of quality to it. And this is how Stapleton described himself. Thou hast taken stars in space to be thy language. Life and death is the music of thy lyre. And Stapleton saw himself as a philosophical poet, as someone who was a writer of great cosmic myths, someone who was literary and dealing with the fundamental existential questions of existence, such as life and death and the meaning of it all. So they had somewhat different backgrounds, but they provided anchor points for the evolution of science fiction over a 45-year period, which is what I cover in volumes 2 and 3. And anybody who is a futurist literally really needs to read and understand H.G. Wells and Olaf Stapleton and what they had to say about the future, and understanding it, both making predictions about it and identifying preferable futures. So volume 2 begins with 2 chapters on H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells was a student of history. He really spent a lot of time attempting to understand and write about history, but not just simply human history, natural history. And he was tremendously influenced by the theory of evolution. He wrote both science fiction, such as The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds, and future studies books like Anticipations. He wrote other books that actually synthesize science fiction and future studies, like The Shape of Things to Come. He wrote about psychology and the evolution of human psychology, as well as technology. He wrote both dystopias and utopias. And he talked about aliens, not just simply in The War of the Worlds and the possibilities of alien civilization, but also The First Men on the Moon. And he wrote several novels about future war, such as The War in the Air and The World Set Free. And he was part of a heightened consciousness during the early decades of the 20th century on the possibilities of technologically advanced war, and why the world as it was globally and culturally organized at the time was heading toward war. So there's a lot in Wells, both theoretical and science fiction, between both sets of books, and some of his books overlap between the two. And I begin volume 2 with 2 chapters on H.G. Wells. But while Wells was writing his novels and his nonfiction books, a real rich profusion of other science fiction novels were being written in those first 2 decades. The most powerful and immense global war that was written during that time was written by George Griffith, The Angel of the Revolution, which far exceeds The War of the Worlds or The War in the Air in terms of carnage and technological advancement. There's disasters written like Darkness and Dawn trilogy and The Purple Cloud. There's utopian visions of the future, such as The Year 3000. There's great monstrosities in vision like The Lost World. And there's visions of superhumans, such as The Wonder by Beresford, who was a student of H.G. Wells, but in fact wrote stuff on his own too. So we find technological extrapolation, we find utopian visions, we find adventure, we find disaster, we find various kinds of monstrous realities that were written during that time. And in fact, which you might not be able to see, I don't know if you could see it on your screen, The Nightland, written by Hutchins, is one of the most imaginative books of that period, which takes place millions of years in the future when the sun has gone dark and an individual goes on a great adventure that involves time travel and involves encountering all kinds of different envisioned future terrors and horrors. And that was one of the most intellectually powerful novels of that period. So there's a lot that was written besides Wells during that time Wells was flourishing. We find a lot of adventure and imaginative creations during the 1910s and 1920s as well. Edgar Rice Burroughs, who I spent a lot of time talking about, probably is the biggest selling science fiction, science fantasy writer of all time. His stuff has remained in popularity for 100 years now. And he wrote about adventures on Mars, adventures on Venus, adventures on the moon, and all told, say, 15 to 20 science fantasy adventures that he wrote during the period of 1910 to 1930, which I go into. Who isn't as well known today, but was more imaginative, was Abraham Merritt in The Moon Pool and The Metal Monster as his two best works. The Metal Monster is a fascinating study in a collective group intelligence living form that consists of trillions upon trillions of individual and transposable moving metallic parts that can organize itself into various shapes depending upon its particular intentions. It's a really interesting exercise in the imagination of what technological intelligence could turn into. So there's lots of adventure going on. Navigators of Infinity by the Belgian-French writer Rosny the Elder is a very good love story between a human and a female Martian Grace with 6 eyes. But you got to read it to believe it, but it's very touching. Oh, clicking. Okay, there we go. Lots of dystopias were written during the early part of the 20th century, which I cover. City of Endless Night, which anticipates Nazism, The Messiah in the Cylinder, which envisions a scientific utopia. Brave New World, which everyone is familiar with. The Iron Heel, and probably the best dystopia of the time was Yevgeny Zamyatin, which is the first book that the Soviet Union censored after the Zamyatin had written it around 1920. But one utopia which was written during that period, which is definitely worth reading, is a society entirely of women, Herland. And it's a very thoughtful and interesting vision of what an ideal human society would be like, but indeed an ideal human society consisting entirely of women. Science fiction magazines begin to come on the scene and proliferate, primarily due to Hugo Gernsback, who began with the magazine Electrical Experimenter, and then Science and Invention, and then Amazing Stories and Science Wonder Stories. Gernsback is remembered for inventing or popularizing the contemporary expression science fiction. Before Gernsback came along, science fiction was not the word or the expression used to refer to the genre. But Gernsback believed that science fiction, or as he originally called it, scientifiction, was a way to predict and to invent the future, to inspire people to create a positive future through technology. And Ralph 124C41 Plus, which reads another way as Ralph 124C for the many, is filled with predictions of the future, terribly written novel, which appeared in one of his magazines, but has a lot of actual predictions that came through in the coming decades. So science fiction magazines begin to proliferate in the 1920s and 30s, and I spent quite a bit of time talking about the magazines. But also in the 20s and the 30s, actually beginning with Méliès and silent films, we get some really interesting and powerful science fiction movies. And part of the power of science fiction is indeed that one can put it up on the screen, turn it into these dramatic visual extravaganzas, such as Metropolis by Fritz Lang and Thea von Harbo, which at the time of its production was the most expensive movie ever made. But they also did a very compelling and interesting second movie called Woman in the Moon. Von Harbo wrote both screenplays, and Von Harbo wrote a book, a novel to go along with Metropolis, but also produced during that time was Elita, Goddess of Mars, which you can watch on YouTube, and actually is a communist science fiction movie in which the Martians are converted to communism. And you got to see it to believe it, but she is in fact Alita, and you can see a picture of her up on the screen there, was an extremely strange and mesmerizing, almost psychotic presence. So when the movies come in the 20s, science fiction movies start to make an impact. Science fiction broadens now to include literature, magazines, and we'll come to the next part, which is comics, as well as the cinema. So science fiction becomes multimedia as we move through the 1920s. Now we turn to volume 3, just to highlight some stuff in volume 3. I begin with the emergence of science fiction comics and the archetypal original science fiction superhero who was Superman, created in the 1930s. Superman may have been inspired, and you can read my book if you want to find out how, by a novel written by Philip Wiley about 10 years earlier called Gladiator. And in a lot of ways, there are similarities between Superman and Gladiator. But Superman is the beginning of superheroes. But also during this time, we see Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon go up on the screen, and H.G. Wells' novel Shape of Things to Come, as well as The Island of Dr. Moreau, which was produced as Island of Lost Souls, are made into cinematic productions. And so we begin to get talkies now in the 1930s, science fiction movies, which are have sound as well as are visual. And so science fiction increases in terms of its multimedia dimensions with the emergence of talkies. And science fiction magazines during the 1930s enrich along many different dimensions with very compelling tales of aliens like Old Faithful, and very interesting and time looping stories like The Time Stream and Sideways in Time. Time travel keeps growing as a particular theme, and the Legion of Time, which involves time wars, and other visions of the future evolution of humans like Creatures of the Light. And new monsters come on the scene like John Campbell's Who Goes There, which was eventually turned into a movie, The Thing, in fact, 3 or 4 movies. So science fiction continues to blossom and flourish through magazines throughout the 1930s and discusses almost every different aspect of the future one can conceive of during that period of time. We see a further evolution, though, in cosmic horror and the fantastical with H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith, who were friends, knew each other, and corresponded, and wrote some of the most literary science fiction of the 20th century. Lovecraft is often remembered for being such a visionary of horror, but to read Lovecraft, you really get a deep appreciation of how superb a writer he was at creating very vividly powerful, bizarre creatures and scenes. He is spooky and unreal, like in The Color Out of Space and The Shadow of Time, but he's a great writer. And Clark Ashton Smith, perhaps even a greater writer than Lovecraft and his friend, wrote a slew of very lyrical, poetical science fiction stories like The City of the Singing Flame and The Monster of the Prophecy. And in fact, there are, on YouTube right now, there are shows on both Lovecraft and The Emperor of Dreams, which I highly recommend watching, a biography of Clark Ashton Smith. And both of them are writing during the 1930s, and I cover them in depth in the volume 3. Science fiction further invades the world in the 1930s with science fiction plays coming on the scene, like Roar by Karl Čapek, which is where the word robot is first used, although what isn't so much known is that it was his brother who came up with the term robot, not Čapek. And The War with the Newts, which is a extremely comical and rich novel of the world taken over by lizards. And it might sound kind of dorky and strange, but in fact, it's a very intelligent work. And Čapek, though, also was very comical in the way he looked at humanity. We have great disasters. One of the best written during that time was When Worlds Collide, which was eventually made into a movie. And when I say science fiction invades the world, we have Orson Welles, 1938, I believe, production on the radio of the Mercury Theater of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, which lots of people believed was really happening. So between Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers and Orson Welles and War of the Worlds, science fiction further enters into human consciousness in the 1930s, for sure. It was in the 1920s and 30s that we get the blossoming of what came to be called space operas. And space operas are the origin of a lot of contemporary science fiction cinema, as well as science fiction literature. For example, Star Wars is classic space opera. Space opera are stories involving outer space, big spaceships, great adventures, tons of aliens, battles among humans and aliens, often aliens as partners, often as enemies. And the two great architects of 1930s space operas, Edmund Hamilton, there with his wife Lee Brackett, and Doc Smith, evolved space operas to incredible scales of imagination. We have planets, stars, even galaxies being destroyed and obliterated in these novels that Hamilton and Doc Smith wrote during the 1920s and 30s. And we have the Lensman, which Doc Smith invented, which was a technologically empowered group of humans and aliens who are given extraordinary psychic powers through the wearing of a technological wristband, which is referred to as the lens. We have a lot of discussion about psychic abilities too in Doc Smith as well. But between Doc Smith and Hamilton, we journey to the farthest reaches of the universe. We have colossal battles involving millions of spaceships, some of which are tens of miles in length. We have incredible technological imagination and weaponry of galactic level powers. We have traveling at almost instantaneous speeds throughout the galaxies. We have a real imagination flourishing there. And this becomes Star Trek. This becomes Star Wars 30, 40 years later. This is where it starts with the two of them. But finally, in volume 3, I talk about Ola Stapleton. And Ola Stapleton was a philosopher as opposed to educated in science and technology. And Ola Stapleton did not write that many science fiction novels, but he wrote some of the most powerful and extravagant science fiction novels of all time. Excuse me. With the theme of cosmic evolution. In Last and First Men, he extrapolates out 2 billion years into the future and traces the future evolution of humanity through 18 different species. In Star Maker, he goes out 30 to 50 billion years into the future and traces the further evolution of intelligence in the universe and how intelligence in the universe integrates together into a cosmic mind. Oddjohn is not cosmic, but it's an interesting study of a superhuman, advanced human, just like Cirrus, which he also wrote, is an interesting, highly philosophical and introspective study of a super intelligent dog. Now, at the end of volume 3, I do a little comparison and a little integration. And I use as a frame or overarching theme, the eyes of evolution, because the central theoretical idea that inspired and informed both Wells and Stapleton was the theory of evolution, which they applied to humanity, nature, and the universe as a whole. Stapleton did it on a much grander scale than Wells, but Wells was thoroughly evolutionary in how he envisioned the future of humanity, and as well as Stapleton. And I have up here images of 3 precursors to Wells and Stapleton, who I briefly mentioned along the way, Edward Bueller Lytton in Vril, The Power of the Coming Race, Camille Flammarion, and John Jacob Astor, all of whom in the late 19th century, after the emergence of Darwin's theory of evolution, their science fiction works were powerfully informed by the theory of evolution. Evolution became a central thematic element in science fiction, at least in Europe, and toward the end of the 19th century. And Wells and Stapleton, both of them embraced it as very fundamental to understanding the future. Now, what happens is that by the time we get to Stapleton, the scope and breadth of evolutionary theory expands to include the entirety of the universe and the entirety of the future history of the universe. So earlier on, we have more limited visions. By the time we get to Stapleton, everything is seen through the eyes of evolution. And in fact, Stapleton actually provides in Star Maker and Last and First Men an evolutionary theory of the nature of reality and an evolutionary theory of ethics, in that Stapleton explains what reality is in terms of the theory of evolution. And he explains what the good is and how one pursues the good in terms of the theory of evolution. And Wells, in a lot of ways, does something similar. In fact, I make a comparison at the end of the book, and people might be able to add other scenarios here. 3 different ethical scenarios for the future. Wells envisions the good future as a global human society, highly educated, revolving around psychology and psychological advancement. That is, Wells sees the preferable future as involving the further advance of the human mind, not so much technology, the further advance of the human mind, and becoming global as opposed to nationalistic, and becoming educated. Doc Smith, in his space operas, keeps the old Zoroastrian vision of ethics that the universe involves a battle between good and evil. And in Doc Smith's space operas, it's an escalating war of good versus evil. And indeed, if you look at lots of the contemporary science fiction cinema space operas, it will always, not always, but very often be conceptualized as a battle between the good guys and the bad guys. That's what all Star Wars is, between the Force and the dark side of the Force. And so Doc Smith represents, even though it's technologically super duper in a lot of ways, a vision of what is the good, conceptualized as this battle between the freedom fighters and those who want to oppress our freedom. Good versus evil. When we get to Stapleton, the good becomes a cosmic, communal self-enlightenment of all the sentient beings of the universe. It's not primarily a war, rather it's a individual and collective rise of consciousness. And I take this to be an evolution of myth, of the kind of myths we have about good and evil, and what is the good and what isn't the good, and how do we pursue what is good, and what are the challenges going to be. For Stapleton, the challenges are more in the nature of our own limitations than some projected evil force outside of us. Often, Wells and Stapleton are seen as rather pessimistic, sometimes even as defeatists. And people complain a lot even today about how science fiction is very negative. But if you look at both Wells and Stapleton, which I do toward the end of volume 3, what you find is really an optimism, but an optimism which is tempered by reality. That is, we will make progress. We will evolve in the future, but it's going to involve an oscillation of order and chaos. It's going to involve both disasters and successes, both developments and extinctions. So in both of them, and Stapleton in particular, we do evolve, we do progress, but it's not an easy process. And we often fall on our face, and we often come to the edge of going extinct. But there is a deep optimism that's there, at least in Stapleton, regarding our future. And as a final point of comparison, Wells opened up time travel to vast distances in the future in the time machine. He looked ahead first 800,000 years, and then he looked ahead 30 million years in that story, in that novel. But when we come, by the time we come to Stapleton, Stapleton is looking ahead billions and billions of years into the future, but building upon Wells. So there are more volumes to come. The next one is going to be the Golden Age through the Silver Age, 1940 to 1965, and which I'll be talking about some well-known science fiction works like I, Robot, Asimov's Robot Stuff, and Dune, and A Canticle for Leibowitz, and Robert Heinlein and John Campbell. And then after that, the next one is going to be the New Wave, Star Wars, and Cyberpunk, leading us through Star Wars, Blade Runner, Dangerous Visions, Ursula Gwen, and the beginnings of Cyberpunk with Neuromancer by William Gibson. And then finally, if all goes well, Volume 6, which will be Hyperion, to the Singularity and Beyond, where I anchor that 6th volume to Dan Simmons' fantastic work of imagination, Hyperion, but will include other works like Fire Upon the Deep and cinema like The Matrix, and women writers like Octavia Butler, and passing through the singularity such as Alex Salorando and China Miéville's Perdido Street Station, which is a great example of the new weird in science fiction which emerged in the last couple of decades. And also Chinese science fiction writers such as The Three-Body Problem. Now, all of the content of the first 3 volumes is up on videos on the Video School. In fact, up on the Video School, I have covered ancient times through the Silver Age up through 1965. Modules 1 through 11 cover volumes 1 through 3, which I went over today. But I've actually gone a little bit further, and indeed, we will come back to the science fiction webinars. December the 18th and January the 8th, I'll be doing the next webinar covering the new culture in the new age from 1965 to 1980. The erotic, taboo, blasphemous, dangerous, lyrical, metaphorical, psychedelic, maniacal, and catastrophic. And what happens to science fiction in the period of 1965 to 1980? Or as Philip Jose Farmer put it, if Jules Verne could have really looked into the future, say 1966 is when Farmer wrote this, he would have crapped in his pants. So that one's coming up December the 18th and January the 8th. And also I should mention, for those of you interested, at the World Future Study Federation conference 2 weeks ago, I gave a talk on the purposeful evolution of consciousness. And this is going to be my newest book, and I've actually started a series of essays on it in the newsletter. And so I'll be doing a one-time overview of this new book on how and why we should evolve our consciousness in the future. And that'll be coming up on December the 4th. So that ends the introduction to the 3 volumes.